Orange versus Kalento is the first match that we got coming up, so we can start jumping into that one and take a look at what we have. So let's take a look at Kalento's deck and see what he's brought to the table. It's the good old Mage deck, and with the mainstay of the Frostbolt that he has started the season with. It was his very first match that he played. He had 2 Magic Dart Frogs, 2 Arcane Missiles, and a Frostbolt in there. And while the others have seemed to rotate out, the Frostbolt has become a fairly reasonable linchpin, I think, of the early game where this deck can really struggle.
Yeah, I never really knew about those Dart Frogs. It was something that I was debating with a couple of other casters when we were watching the early weeks of Grandmasters. A lot of people were in favor of them, and I just didn't really see them having a high enough impact, so it's no surprise to me to see those melting away as the weeks have progressed forwards. But that Frostbolt, I think, is a beautiful thing. I think it's a fantastic card, and I think it makes even more sense when you've built this deck in the way that Kalento has, where neither of his additional decks are leaned towards Rogue. We talked about this yesterday when Bunny Hopper was playing a single halftime scavenger in his core mage deck. So his primary deck was tilted ever so slightly towards Rogue. Kalento's doing kind of that same thing with Frostbolt. And it's just the way he's chosen to put things together with the 3 decks. They have to come together as a package, and that kind of makes sense.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that he doesn't have a strategy prepared for Rogue, because that is exactly what Orange has brought to the table. And if you look at Europe, it is 4 Cyclone Mages and 2 Rogue decks that are brought to the table. In Orange, I feel like the Rogues nailed it this week, where Mage is one of the matchups that slight matchup you're going to get an edge on at this point. And so I think that bringing Rogue in the spot where the other 4 players who are non-Rogues have brought Mage, that's the biggest edge you're going to get, I think, in deck building.
We're going to fight on this a little bit. It's going to keep coming up. I don't personally believe primary versus primary is hugely Rogue favored, if at all. But where I will absolutely agree with you is when the secondary deck comes in here and the Walk the Planks and the Betrayal and the Fairy Dragon come in. Not only do the mages not really tech back against that by having a secondary or tertiary deck for the Rogue, you have to ask the bigger question of how can they tech back against that, right? Like, their whole game plan is just to explode onto the board with big minions and dominate the game. If you're playing against a deck that can play tempo and then punish you with efficient removal afterwards, how do you adapt a mage deck to fight back against that?
You completely swap archetypes.
Ah, right, yeah, that makes sense. With just 5 cards.
Everybody knows about that other mage archetype that's really good.
Could you like transform it into freeze mage, maybe? Like with just burn damage? That doesn't work, does it? No.
You need a lot of cards for that.
Yeah. Well, meanwhile, game number 1 of this opening round match, of course. All of these opening round matches are kind of never before seen encounters as far as Grandmasters goes, because these are the cross-divisional matchups. Seed number 2 from their respective division crosses over into the other division's bracket, if you want to look at it that way. So Kalento is here as the invader, trying to take this win away from Orange.
I'm going to hit you with a thought here. If I saw this correctly, Orange kept Vendetta in his hand.
Did he now? Did he keep Blink Fox Vendetta, or did he just Vendetta?
I believe it was just Vendetta.
Interesting. Okay. I mean, I don't hate it. It's a very, very powerful card to when you don't have those key removals in your deck. There's kind of 2 ways to look at it, right? If you don't have the Walk the Plank, Sap, Betrayal stuff piled into your deck, you can keep the Vendetta because it's one of the most effective ways, if you can get it down to 0, to deal with giants when they come down. The other way to make that argument is to say, well, my deck isn't built to play that kind of game, so I'm just going to mulligan for max pressure, and then I'm going to kill them instead. So I don't know, I can kind of see it both ways.
I like it. The thing that I've noticed is a lot of players have not kept Vendetta.
Game plan! Sorry to interrupt you.
Damage plus damage plus damage.
Yeah.
Plus big damage. This is, I think, a really interesting spot here for Orange. Something that he's opened my eyes to with the Rogue versus Mage matchup is the idea that Mage can be gassed out. I mean, that's kind of an unusual thought, where if you think about it, most of the time that Warriors have tried to just simply gas out a Mage, what ends up happening is lots of things pile onto the board and they don't end up winning. I think the reason it doesn't really work for Warriors, you don't necessarily have a pressure plan. Your pressure plan, I would say, is inconsistent at best. But when it's at its best, it's pretty good. That's kind of how Bomb Warrior is in a nutshell.
Yeah.
But with Rogue, you have a lot of different angles of pressure. You have a massive amount of burst. And so I think when you can combine those two plans, you can get some pretty significant payoffs in the right spot. And so for Orange, having this Blink Fox Frost bolted, I think this is the start of a bad situation for him, where he still has a pretty good shot given his hand.
Yeah. This is a philosophy or a concept that I kind of picked up from Zalay, and it was one of the first like real epiphanies about Hearthstone that I had in a long time. You know, as you are learning the game early on, those epiphany moments, those eureka moments happen all the time, right? But later on, it becomes a lot more of a struggle to find those big breakthroughs. But Zalay was on stream one day talking about the value of going face, as he said it, where if you're a deck that applies pressure, that pressure causes your opponent to use their high value cards for less value because they're under pressure. I think that goes to explain why, in your case, Rogue can sometimes outvalue a mage in this matchup. Because they put pressure on, some of the value from the mage is taken away by them like having to scramble and like Conjurers calling their 3-drops or their 4-drops just to fight onto the board.
Yeah.
And just sometimes that's just a huge chunk of the value in their deck gone.
Indeed. It's a tough choice. I'm looking at Rebuke being able to solidify some pressure points. I was looking at Unleash the Hounds being able to perhaps make some work on a Mirror Image turn or a big Mana Cyclone Sorcerer's Apprentice turn.
And I was looking at Nourish Rampant to Pyroblast them in the face.
Yeah, just like every Rogue deck does.
Yeah. No, that was probably the most ridiculous prospect out of the three.
Well, 6 mana Nourish, yeah.
Observe and reflect.
Yeah. If it kind of hit his curve next turn, then yeah, maybe we could talk about it, but seems unlikely in that spot.
So this hand is, it's gotten a little clunky for Kolento. With 2 Sorcerer's Apprentice, I could see one of these being used. The Coin and Ziliax, I feel like, is the one play I definitely want to avoid in this situation. I feel like that Coin's important.
Why is that?
Number 1, I'm looking at a Mana Cyclone. Number 2, I'm looking at a hand that doesn't really do anything right now.
Right.
If you end up coining here and then you draw an Arcane Intellect, like, you're going to have a number of dead turns, it feels like.
Yeah. I think throwing away the coin, yeah, I think Arcane Intellect is a great thing to point out because then you don't have any flexibility on other 3 mana cards that you pick up off the AI afterward, but even, like, throwing away the coin, which is, you know, mild ramp, and also shrinking down your hand size by spending 2 cards, you're also then weakening Mountain Giant draws, like Archmage Antonidas. If that comes into your hand, that's looking weaker as well, which is kind of the big kicker that even Orange himself actually talked about, right? That if you do try and outvalue a mage, it often only works if they've taken the Antonidas out of their deck to tech against you. So yeah, a lot of impact. Just simple decision of using a coin there, which it just looks like a very straightforward play, right? Coin Ziliax, kill the 4/3, but he doesn't have to. The coin's valuable. His hand size is valuable.
You also have to think about, you know, Orange's hand. He doesn't have a particularly large hand read right now. He's seen Blink Fox and he's seen Hedge Clan Burglar. Those are about the things that Orange wants to do every single game.
Right.
He has no idea if there's Backstab, if there's Edwin, if there's Spirit of the Shark turns, Evil Miscreant. Like, perhaps you're giving them a way to interact in a situation where Orange is going to take that time to say, I'm going to rebuke, I'm going to play a 4/4, I'm going to hit you in the face, and I'm going to hope that this is good enough to start this train of damage. And I think the Leroy draw might have been what prompted this.
It may be, yeah. It's interesting, though, to do it into a Ziliax turn. Like, I expect that rebuke in that situation is just kind of a, yikes, my hand kind of sucks, let's just do something, or this turn specifically, let's just do something kind of mana efficient and get a 4/4 onto the board, because how many high impact spells are you looking to beat on that turn?
Well, perhaps it also has to do with the fact that he didn't see Ziliax, that he didn't see Coin Ziliax.
Okay.
Thinking to himself, maybe he doesn't have Ziliax at all. And so that this rebuke becomes, you know, it becomes pretty massive if there's no Ziliax on Kolento's side.
Sure.
Like if Kolento, let's just say that he had Mountain Giant on that turn instead. Orange is then looking at a Vendetta and hit it with a Waggle Pick and smack Kolento for 8. With a Leroy in hand.
Yep. No, I completely agree.
Yeah.
That's why I say, like, using the rebuke there just to get a 4/4 Edwin on the board is totally reasonable. Like, even if it's not necessarily disrupting a huge spell, with the upside of sometimes disrupting a spell.
And look at the turn that the Mountain Giant shows up. This is prime.
Seems like a pretty good turn to me. I wasn't sure which way you're going with that. I was like, this looks like a pretty good turn for it to show up
well,
to me.
If Mountain Giant showed up last turn, and then somehow Kolento ends up landing on Mountain Giant, which I don't think he would have.
And reflect.
Sort of one of the keys I want to point out with this deck is you don't always plop a Giant. In game 1, sometimes you do. Games 2 and 3, it's very different.
Right.
So many times I see players play this deck, and they're very much on the side of they never play their Giant or they always play their Giant. I'm in a situation where I feel like it always depends on your hand and what you're facing down. There are no rules with the mage deck.
Clemson looked like he was leaning Sorcerer's Apprentice there for a second, which I'd be surprised not to see the Giant come down here. The problem with like Giant is kind of like the last remaining good thing in your hands right now. I can definitely see that point, and like you're kind of giving it up almost to the board state, at least one of them, but there's still a big demand to kill that second Giant or second Grave Horror that comes out, and if it doesn't, like your turns are pretty much set for the rest of the game at that point.
Well, I feel like that SI is a bit of a blessing of a draw, where Orange was looking at floating 3 mana alongside of this, and then suddenly you have an SI7 agent, now you have options for how you want to play this.
So you were thinking Vendetta Waggle Pick as like the default?
That was my default.
Yeah, and then SI just fills out the curve really nicely.
But now
Makes
I'm
sense.
looking at it, and I'm thinking perhaps Vendetta Spear to the Shark SI7 agent.
Then you leave one up, don't you? Am I missing something?
I intend to leave one up here.
Really?
Well, I'm going to have a Spear to the Shark in play. I'm going to have a Waggle Pick and a
That's
Life
true.
Drinker
No,
with
okay.
Leroy.
All right. No, you've made me interested.
I can see it both ways. I think the Waggle Pick getting developed is important, but same thing for Spear to the Shark, though. You know, how long are you going to have to really activate combos and battle cries?
Right.
I think this is a really tough turn
You
for
see Orange's mouse movements just going through exactly the same process right now. That's kind of crazy. There's also the other option. You just do it this way and just, like,
hit him in the face.
Go face, ignore the second Giant. They don't always get taunts. Sometimes you have to take risk. Yeah, actually, I like, after much deliberation, I've actually come to the same place where the Orange did. I think this makes a lot of sense.
I think going face when you have Leroy, Life Drinker, Pyroblast, Spear to the Shark, that sounds good.
Yep.
Orange is at 26, Kalinto is at 14.
That damaged face is actually super important, and like I said that, you know, there's a plan as soon as the Pyroblast appears, and then actually kind of forgot about it, because even if the defensive options do come out now from Kalinto to lock this out, Orange only needs to get 4 more damage in, and then he's in Pyroblast range. So he only needs to go Spirit of the Shark Life Drinker, which, you know, bypasses taunts, bypasses Frost Nova, bypasses everything else. So actually, his game plan at this point just becomes live on turn 9. That's all he has to do.
Kalinto finds a counterspell, though, and I think that the counterspell for Kalinto is more in line with thinking of Shadow Step and with the single copy of Eviscerate.
Eviscerate, yep.
From Orange's deck right now. Wow.
That's such an insane turn from Kalinto. You talk about covering all the bases that I just described earlier. Frost Nova comes down, so they're not challenging the Grave Horrors, which then, you know, set him up for quicker potential lethals. The counter spell is in play when the only spell that Orange has available is his win condition Pyroblast right now. Like, it just beat everything that turn.
Exactly. When your condition through this is live through turn 9, and then this happens, are you living through turn 9 anymore?
Right.
So then, look at that play. I mean, maybe you are supposed to kill both Giants. You know that there's a Conjurer's Calling there.
I still think this is fine. I think, like, look at how ridiculous the turn that came back was, right? 2 Sorcerer's Apprentices, plus a Frost Nova that was randomly generated, plus the 1 secret that shuts down your game plan. I think that's pretty reasonable.
I wasn't even thinking about the secret. I was just thinking about dying on turn 9.
Yeah, sure.
That's where my concern, I feel like, rests with this.
I mean, if he doesn't get Frost Nova'd here, he's in a decent play. Like, so much pressure came down alongside this, right? Like, Khadgar Conjurer's Calling was the one way that more pressure came down.
Yeah.
So, like, close to the max pressure came down, but even then, if his board didn't get frozen, he would have outs to remove some of this from the board. So I still think that you're in a position where, like, you made a good play and your opponent just had the max punish for what you tried to do.
You'd be playing around too much stuff otherwise.
That's kind of weirdly helpful.
So Doomsayer, a lot of times when you see that off of Faceless Lackey, it just ends up being a pure liability for the player who got it.
Not here, though.
Yeah, here, though, it feels more like a heal for 7 card.
Right.